Howdy y'all. So the first thing we're going to cover today is we're going to talk about the type of handles that we are going to use to attach to our glass knuckles. So what I like to use is this 32 millimeter heavy wall Pyrex tubing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to flare out the end of it to accumulate glass so that when I fuse that handle onto my knuckle, I have an allowance of glass so that when I pull it down a little bit, it's not going to completely separate or cause shock from a very thick piece of glass to a thinner piece of glass. I want a nice buildup of mass to transfer heat back and forth. I don't want it to be too thick and I don't want it to be too thin. So just like we do on a handle that's 12 millimeters to a blank that is 20 millimeters, we're just creating that flare. We're gathering back some glass so that when we handle up, we can do the push and then pull method that'll give us a nice clean handle to work from as we add a ton of heat and start to do some major movements with the type of heat base that we're going to be working with and the types of pulling that we're going to be doing today. So as you can see today, I did not use a titanium lens to record these videos, so a lot of what I'm doing in the flame isn't as visible. And the reason I did that was because when you work with these large pieces of tubing, you can see through the flame so well that initially when I recorded it, I didn't think that I needed to put the lens on it. Later in the video, you will see when we're making the chillum that I probably should have popped that on there. But I think, at least in my opinion, you can still pretty much see everything that's going on. So I am sorry that I didn't put the titanium lens on for this lesson, but I still hope it's really helpful for you guys. Also remember that today we are working with so much heat. I'm not wearing sleeves in this video, and I'm not wearing any type of protection on my chest. You may really enjoy getting a pair of heat sleeves for yourself, or possibly just wearing a couple layers, like a long sleeve shirt and a jacket if it's cold enough outside, but something to protect your skin from the heat that will be radiating off of this glass. I got a little toasty towards the end of this, but luckily this knuckle wasn't as large as the ones I've gotten in the past where I've needed to protect my skin from the amount of radiating heat that is going to be coming off of these knuckles. So just know it is hot. I'm not immune to it. I just merely forgot to wear a long sleeve shirt this day. That was my bad. And here you're going to have your two flared handles. So the knuckle we're going to be working with today is just over a pound, I think. I think it was like 1.3 or 1.4 pounds, but not quite 1.5 pounds. So this is a relatively smaller knuckle. If you're not used to working with knuckles, I would definitely recommend getting them on the smaller side if you can get them, just to try them out. So as you see here, I am just heating up the face of that knuckle. I'm packing in a bunch of heat because that wall is super thick. And the idea here is that I'm going to prep the end of this so that then I can bring in my handle and attach to the end fairly quickly and fairly easily. Because as you can see, there's a flame coming out the end of that tube. And the reason that there's a flame coming out the end of that tube is because my grabbers are not actually very strong. And so I'm having to rely on the strength in my wrists and my fingers to keep this thing turning, which is very difficult when you have it completely horizontal. So what I'm doing is allowing it to slightly come up vertically, but when I let it come up vertically, the flame is going to shoot through that tube and get really close to my hand and get close to the inside of my grabbers, which I don't want to happen. So I'm trying my best to avoid that, but at the same time, working with a not quite a 1.5 pound knuckle, it can be trying and very heavy and difficult to do. So here, just like the other videos that I have showed you, we are going to handle it the exact same way as if you were handling up 12 millimeter to 20 millimeter. It's going to be the push and pull technique, but as you can see, I'm not going to get the heat base quite right, so I am going to leave it in the flame after it's connected, and I'm going to work out any portion of that surface that is not completely fused, because once I take this out of the flame and I give it a nice little tug, if there's any discrepancies in the fluidity from the knuckle to the handle, that's going to cause an issue with surface tension, and it's also going to cause issues with the thermal dynamics of moving heat in and out of that knuckle and down into the clear handle. So what I'm looking for right here is I'm looking for a nice even flow. I don't want the knuckle to be too thick coming into the handle, and I don't want the handle to be too thin coming into the knuckle. So what I'm doing here is I've decided that the knuckle shoulder is too thick. So what I want to do is pack a ton of heat into the shoulder of that knuckle before it enters the flare of that handle. Pack heat into it, let the heat go from the exterior to the interior of that tubing. I'm holding it horizontal to make sure that excess heat is going up and not down into the clear. And then I'm going back in and I'm reworking that exact same technique again until I get a better consistent flow from the handle to the knuckle. I want to make sure that this thing doesn't just clean break off whenever I'm working with it, because that can happen if the glass is too thin to the thickness ratio. I'm doing some little micro adjustments with my hands. I'm trying to make sure that everything's staying nice and centered. I've decided I like where the glass is right now, and so I'm going to go ahead and take it off of my grabbers. Be careful when you do this. Don't just let it fall off or fall out, because then it'll bust everywhere and you'll get hot stuff all over the place. So here I've taken it to my L-marver and I'm just making sure that that knuckle is center. Now that knuckle itself is not evenly pulled all the way through. So what I'm trying to do is when I bring it out of the L-marver or into it, the weight is evenly balanced as best it can be, so that when I add my next handle onto it, I'm not going to be fighting at a strange angle to pull this knuckle back and forth, as you'll see here in a minute. All right, so now that it's done, I'm going to put this in the kiln for at least 15 minutes to allow the entirety of this vessel to come up to temperature, because we are about to start smacking this thing with a ton of heat, because at the largest section of this knuckle, it is 3 inches, which is about 76 millimeters thick. It's big, it's heavy, it's hot. My advice to anybody who wants to pull down knuckles regularly is to get a very nice pair of bench rollers. It is going to significantly help you so much, because you are not a lathe, I'm not a lathe. Our hand strength and our forearm strength and our shoulder strength is only going to go so far, and yes, you can build it up, but you also don't want to tear it up. So be aware of your limitations, be aware of what's going to actually be easier on you in the long run, and be aware of what is actually going to be more beneficial. Like, yeah, we love to have strong hands, but also like we love to have shorter work days too. So keep all those things in mind when you're deciding how and why you work with a certain type of glass. So now that we have just smacked this thing full of heat, we have just roasted and toasted it all the way up to a nice molten temperature, we're going to introduce our second flare. My hand is getting so tired, my wrists are getting very tired, and so I'm going to prop it up on my hip while I alleviate some stress out of my arm while I get this handle ready to go. All right, now I'm going to take them both in the flame. I'm going to attach them in the flame because they're not quite hot enough to flow evenly back and forth. So I then need to work out any hard edges or any places where the glass is not flowing. I don't want a hard stop anywhere. A hard stop means a quick and easy way to get a shattered, broken, or fractured piece of glass. So what I'm doing is I'm working in the edges from the knuckle into the handle or the clear piece of tubing. So here I've packed a lot of heat into that knuckle and into the handle, and now I'm just kind of rocking it back and forth. I'm just reintroducing it into the idea of being centered and symmetrical. Like I said, that knuckle is not centered on one side. It's larger on one side than the other. So I'm having to wiggle that clear handle into a space where it is going to pull straight. I don't want to pull drastically to one side or the other. I'm going to have to combat that when I'm actually pulling it later. So I want to make sure it's as even as possible. And I want to remind you, yes, I am tired. Yes, I am hot. Yes, this is difficult. This is not easy. I hope I make it look easy, but just know that, like, wowzer, if you have a hard time doing this, that's okay. We're all having a hard time doing this. It is not easy. So now that I have the handle where I want, at the thickness that I want, at the angle that I want, I'm going to take advantage of the fact that there is already heat packed into that thicker end of that knuckle. And I'm going to start reintroducing heat and making sure that I'm doing my proper heat sinks before I do my initial pull. If I don't sink heat from the exterior to the interior wall of that knuckle properly, when I go to do a pull, I'm going to be pulling on absolutely nothing. It's not going to be going anywhere. So this first pull is going to be very important because this is where you're going to find out where and how fast your glass is moving and how you should then proceed to pull the rest of your tubing. If this is the thickest, most meatiest, most dense piece of the tubing, you need to watch how it moves on this first pull. This will change angles in a second so you can see what I'm doing here, but I'm doing a very slight pull just to gauge where that glass is moving and how it's moving. So now that I've determined how to work with it, I'm going to move forward by packing in a lot of heat and now doing these larger, more significant pulls. As you can see, I'm packing in heat. I'm coming in, I'm taking the rubber of my shoes and I'm holding that glass end and I'm just tugging and getting more and more length out of this tubing. You do not have to pull your tubing like this. This is just to save my arms on becoming too exhausted too quickly, and this is just easier for me personally, but you do not have to go this route of pulling with your feet. So just remember, after we do a nice pull, we're coming back up into the torch. We're packing heat into the thicker portion that we're wanting to just continue to pull down. I wanted to change the camera angle for you to show you I'm going back in. I'm heating up a section, and after that section is nice and hot and ready to move, then I'm going to go back down and I'm going to do a final pull with my feet where I feel as though the tubing is thin enough where I can then start just pulling it down by hand. So this is going to be my last pull with my feet. Nice little tug. I'm going to stop. I'm going to turn the tube, tug, stop, turn, and then tug again. That way I can just see how it's turning and pulling all the way around. So at this point, I'm feeling very confident about the diameter of the tubing that I can just begin to start pulling down by hand. And just remember, I'm heating it up, I'm taking it out of the flame, and when I'm pulling it, I'm also pull, turn, pull, turn, pull, turn. I don't want it to sag anywhere. I want it to stay nice and centered, and I want to also keep an eye on every side of that tubing, north, east, south, and west, to make sure it's all pulling at the same rate. So now I'm moving back down and I see that there's some discrepancy in the size of the tubing, so I'm hitting that thicker piece of tubing. I'll take it out, I'm going to pull it down. Now when I'm done with this tubing, it will be slightly different on both sides, and that's going to be okay. It's going to be relatively the same size. But what I don't want to do is pull it too thin where then I have to gather it back later to create a thicker piece to create maybe a different shape or a different sized object. So I want to leave one of these handles relatively thick in case I want to blow out something really big, like a big vessel, a cup, a base bottom, just anything that might need a larger portion of glass and a thicker portion to begin with. So what I'm doing here is my initial heat sink, because what we are going to do is cut this piece of tubing in half with my V-cutter on the table. So I'm going to do an initial heat sink. I'm going to take it out of the flame. I'm going to roll it within the V-cut, create my beginning crease. I'm not going to press super hard. I'm just creating a pathway that I will then follow on my second introduction to the V-groove. So when I take it out of the flame, I'm going to allow the heft and the weight of this tubing to just rest as much or as little as it wants in this V-groove. I'm allowing the natural weight to create the cut. I'm turning it with my hands forward because my hands are tired. But now I'm gonna take it out of the V-groove. I'm gonna turn my flame down to a thin flame because I'm gonna let one side get cooler and I'm gonna make sure the other side stays hot. Little breath of air, just quickly cooling one side down, keeping the other side hot. And then I'm gonna hold up, I'm gonna wait for a second, and I'm gonna wiggle it. Last cool breath of air, and then I'm gonna pop it off. And now you've got two separate sections. All right, so now I'm just going in and I'm flaring open a piece of 12mm tubing, and I'm gonna make it a little bit thicker than I usually do because we still have a little bit of pulling down to do from our initial pull off of that knuckle. The section that we've just created, we now need to pull that down even thinner from about 32mm down to about 12mm, so quite a bit. All right, so I'm gonna bring our section out of the kiln that's been garaging. I'm going to introduce it into the flame. I'm gonna make sure the front or the face of where we created that score line and we popped it off, I'm gonna make sure all of that is nice and molten. It's moving because what I wanna do is I want to reopen the portion of that face to be about the same size as the tube itself. It's not going to be exact same size, but it's going to have a slight shoulder, just a small heat break. But for the most part, I'm just opening it, flaring it open to the diameter of the tubing. So what you're going to see me do is take my reamer and I'm going to pull it out of the flame, put it into my L marver, and what I'm doing is I'm holding that wall weight consistent as I flare it open. I'm making sure that the wall weight is even from the front of that face to the interior of that tubing. I'm looking for a nice even wall weight. So when we initially flared open this 12mm piece of tubing, we gave ourselves an adequate allowance of glass about the same thickness as the tubing that we're pulling so that we have the ability to hold and pack heat from the flare to the thicker piece of tubing without pulling away from the thinner portion of the 12mm piece of tubing or handle. So as you can see, I've already attached my handle and now I'm literally just working that heat back into that thicker piece of tubing. I want that shoulder to move immediately. I want there to be an immediate descending shape from the shoulder of that tubing to the clear handle. What I'm showing you here is you can already see that there is a slope beginning on that shoulder from the thicker piece of tubing to the thinner piece of tubing. I want to make sure that the section that I'm working with isn't going to be a hard 90-degree angle heat break. I want there to be a descending amount of heat into that handle, a decrescendo, if you will, of heat into that handle, because I need that thicker portion of the flare that we initially opened to once again be the size of 12mm when we are done pulling it. So it's going to be going from a flare back down to the same diameter it once was once we start pulling the shoulder of that thicker piece of tubing. So as you can see here, I'm turning while I'm pulling. I'm checking on my north, south, east, and west section of the tubing. Think of the tubing as in a quarter. So there's 4 portions of this tubing, and I want to make sure as I'm turning, as I'm pulling, and as I'm heating, that all 4 sections are equally hot, equally moving, and equally happy. Now I'm just leaning my hands back and forth, just kind of letting the flow of the glass rock back and forth to make sure that the heat isn't going to the wrong places. So as you can see here, I've already encouraged that flare to pull back down closer to a 12 millimeter handle that we initially started with. And what I'm doing here is I'm working that last bit of that little hump of that shoulder down into the correct size that I want it to be to work with it. And here I'm taking a little bit more mass from the larger section and incorporating it or pulling it down into the thinner section so I have a viable piece of tubing at the length that I desire to then create something from the pull. So the tricky part of this is I'm actually heating this tubing and then allowing the heat to flow up into the thinner section of the pull, and that's because the thinner section is still slightly thicker than I want it to be. So I'm allowing that radiant heat that's going up the tube to actually allow me to micro adjust the size of that tubing as I'm actually pulling more length from the width of that thicker piece of tubing. All right, so here my arms are blasted and I am so tired. So I did a really sloppy disconnect from that tube, which I don't advise. That's just like an extra little wasted piece of glass that could have been used for something, but now it is going to be nothing. So I'm just gonna roll that off. I'm just gonna scrap that piece of tubing on the end. Could I have melted that back down to a solid and blown it out? I absolutely could have, but I was being very lazy and very tired at this time. Remember to wash your mouthpiece, guys. It's important. All right, so it's at this point we're going to start the creation of the chillum. What I'm doing here is I'm blowing out any excess thickness on the end of that tube. I'm opening it up to make sure it's all nice and hollow. It's all the same diameter, and then I'm happy with the thickness on the end of the tubing compared to the thickness of the rest of the tubing so that there isn't excess glass on the end of that hollow blank. So the first thing that I'm going to do in making this chillum is create a restriction, and that restriction is going to determine the size of the bowl. And this is going to be important. You can have a big one, you can have a small one. I like to make mine just shy of 1 inch because then I'm going to actually kind of melt it down and then blow it out on the end. But for right now, we're going to decide where on the section of tubing we're going to create a restriction and then how to make it, which is to heat it up, to give it a slight tug, let that glass fall in, and then allow it to naturally gather back onto itself until it is the same diameter as the tubing. Now, when you do that a couple times, what's going to happen is going to sag naturally towards the center, and you are going to get an effortless and easy constriction. Just allow the glass to do what it wants to do naturally, which is to gather at the hottest point, and it wants to incorporate more and more of itself as it begins to condense. Now, you can leave it thick at the same size of the rest of the tubing, but I'm going to give it a slight pull because I want to give this constriction and this chillum a more curvy aesthetic, a more curvy appeal. But you can leave it thick. You don't have to pull it down like I do here. All right, so now we're going to focus on the first section of the body of the chillum. You could kind of think of it as like the chest and shoulders of your chillum. And I like a nice broad shoulder, if you will. So what I'm doing is I'm heating up a section of glass, not letting it naturally gather onto itself, just allowing the glass to fall naturally to the hottest point. I'm doing little puffs of air here and there just to kind of hold the wall weight out. I don't want it to fall in too much. But then when I take it out of the flame, I'm going to blow into it, and I'm not going to create like a full ball, but I'm going to make it nice and round. I want it to be thicker than the blank tubing and the section that we've just pulled away from. I want there to be a defined, thicker portion of this piece. And that's what's going to make it look so curvy. So now what I'm doing is kind of making like the torso and legs. I'm going to do an initial heat and pull, and I'm going to see how fast and how much heat I need to put into this piece to get the desired length from my pole. So I'm going back in. I decided I need to add a little bit more heat to another section. A nice little tug, making a very defined difference between the shoulders and the legs. And now I'm gonna go in and I'm gonna puff out what you might consider like the feet of my chillum. So I'm gonna be doing two things here. I'm gonna be puffing out the shoulder of that bottom section of my chillum where your mouth is going to be on the chillum. And I'm also going to create an allowance of extra color I'm going to pull off of the end to make sure that when I detach the pipe from the handle, that it's not going to be detached on a clear portion. I want to make sure that it's color from tip to tip. So as you can see here, I've created my allowance of glass, and now I'm going back in and kind of puffing out the end of that mouthpiece, or like the feet of that body. And I personally like a little bit of an elongated mouthpiece. Some people like the short, fat, stubby kind. I like kind of like a smooth descent from the roundness of the shoulder to the end of the mouthpiece. I've also shown how to do this while making spoons. I just like the way that looks. I think it looks neat, but you can do whatever you like. You don't have to do what I do, but do take what you enjoy from what I am doing and rework it into your own personal style and how you enjoy doing it. All right, so now I've detached the punny because we're gonna work on this bowl. So initially, this section was thinner than the shoulder of this chillum. So now what I'm doing is I'm taking the length of that bowl and I'm then condensing it down into a larger width. Taking length and creating width by gathering back down and blowing out. I want the bowl to now be the same diameter as the shoulder of my chillum. So as I blow out, this is determining the size of the bowl. When I see the size I desire, I place it into the L marver and I immediately stop the outside of those walls from expanding anymore, but allowing the movement of the wall on the interior of that bowl. So if there's any inconsistencies, I can then kind of work those out with my breath and with a little bit of heat to make sure that from the front of the bowl to the back of the bowl, it is all the same wall weight. And that's going to be really important because you don't want like a weird lip in there where stuff gets caught. So it's at this point, I'm going to focus all of the heat on the very tip of the end of the face of this bowl, add pressure, pop the hole. I'm going to take my reverse tweezers and I'm going to blow really hot air onto my hand, which is going to hurt. And then I'm going to go back in, heat up the face, take my tweezers while not blowing any air. And I'm just going to kind of pick open that small little millimeter hole that I've popped open. I'm rocking them back and forth. I'm opening that lip out. I'm not pressing it in. So that when I go in and I flare it open with my reverse tweezers, it's not pushing a lip into the interior of the bowl that we're then going to have to melt out. I'm just flaring it open. So now I'm going to take my reamer, I'm going to do its initial introduction, I'm going to lightly flare it open, and then I'm going to heat it up more, and I'm going to take that heated section of the bowl into the L marver, place it into the L marver, and then use my reamer at an angle to start at a slight angle and then bring it down flat into the marver to make a nice even wall weight from the tip of the bowl to the back end of the bowl. I want it to be all nice and even because visually it looks much better. And you don't get an instance where it's a lot thicker in the front of the chillum than it is on the back end of the bowl where you can't get things in to clean it out and things like that. So there's the flared open bowl. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in with my hand torch and I'm going to take out any sort of markings or any type of distortion that my reamer made while I was opening it up. I want to melt all that out. I want to look crisp and clean and flawless and effortless. I want it to be all nice and smooth and ripple free. And so that's what I'm doing is I'm just going in and just kind of melting out any lines that my reamer has left behind. So after I've done that, I just see, I have like a little bit of like a bulge on one side of my bowl. So I'm going to heat it up, go in. I'm going to take my round reamer, and I'm just gonna kind of allow that to kind of push it back out. I'm not trying to press it out, I'm just kind of nudging it back into place. And then I'm gonna go in and take out any type of lines that reamer may have left behind. So the next thing we're gonna do is start adding dots to our chillum as decoration. Easy, fast. If you're looking to do something quick to move through production, add some dots, keep it moving. So what I'm doing here is I'm heating up the largest dot that I'm going to place on the entire chillum, and then I'm just going to use the radiant heat that is left within the rest of the stick, and then make smaller descending dots from that radiant heat. So as I get into smaller dots, I'm going to then turn my torch heat down, make my flame smaller, not hotter, smaller, and then move down and add smaller dots as I go. I am going to decide to then make the dots slightly larger. It's going to go big, small, medium to small again as my pattern. And see how fast that was? That took like a minute to add all those dots. Now I'm going to go in with my hand torch, and I'm going to start at the larger dots, melt those in first, allow the radiant heat from melting in those dots to begin to melt in the smaller dots, flash over the smaller dots, make sure those are melted in, and then move to the next section where I have the largest dots, and then melt those in first, and then work my way down to the smaller ones. If you start with the smaller ones first, they will melt all the way in by the time you get done melting in your larger dots. So always melt in the largest dots first, and then the smallest ones. And a lot of the times you'll notice that once you're done working with the large ones, the smaller ones can even already be melted in to the consistency or the height that you want. Remember to work north, south, east, and west on your dots. Make sure the entire dot all the way around the seam has been completely melted in. You don't want to leave any friction on the glass, because I tell you what, you don't want to work this hard to make this piece of glass to have it put into the kiln and have it crack because one of these dots is not fully welded into the surface. Alright, so normally what I would do here is I would take this and put it into the kiln, let it garage, bring it all the way back up to heat, and then remove it from the handle. But because I was just working at the end of that where the mouthpiece is going to be, I know that there is still enough heat to pack in so that I can then detach it. There's not going to be a thermal shock. There isn't going to be a weird heat distribution. There is still a lot of heat surrounding that area where I'm going to be pulling away from. But to always be safe, to always make sure that nothing cracks, nothing explodes, just put it into your kiln or bring it up to temperature with an annealing flame to make sure that it's all even, it's all happy, and it's all nice. So for this mouthpiece, the concentration of my heat is not on the actual mouthpiece itself. It is directly below the mouthpiece, because what I can do, and you're going to notice here I'm being very particular because my dots are so close to the end of my mouthpiece that I need to be very careful about where I'm allowing that heat to flow without melting in those dots. So I'm doing this like very slowly, very incrementally, because I want to always be aware of the decorations that I've already created on a piece that I'm ready to finish. So I'm going to let it set up. I'm going to detach that from the end of the mouthpiece. And then I'm going to go in and clean up the puntee that I'm currently using. I'm going to take my tweezers. I'm going to pull off the excess color glass that I've been peeling off slowly from the pipe. I'm going to heat up a small section of clear, and I'm going to do a press and pop on the end of this mouthpiece. I'm going to get a nice, crisp, even, clean hole for my mouthpiece just by simply a little press, a little tap, pops right off. So here I thought I was going to need my tweezers to reopen this hole, but in fact it's like a really great size. I heated it all up, melted off all the rough edges, and now it's ready to go. So this is the final product. This is just like your kind of standard chillum. Well, I hope you all enjoyed this lesson. If you have any questions, ask down in the comments, and yeah, have a good one. Thanks for watching.